You don't lack time, and you never did. The belief that effort automatically earns results is false. You wake up, move through the same routines, touch the same tasks, and still end the day with the quiet feeling that nothing actually shifted. You tell yourself you are consistent, yet every day contains small pauses where you slow down without noticing, where you delay without naming it, where you soften standards just enough to stay comfortable while still calling it discipline. You don't quit. You adjust. You don't collapse. You negotiate. You don't stop working. You lower the intensity just enough to protect yourself from discomfort while pretending progress is still happening. You say you are trying. You say you are showing up. You say you are doing what needs to be done. And all of that sounds correct on the surface, but the results you expected are not showing up, and that gap keeps getting harder to explain. You feel it late at night when the noise drops and there is nothing left to distract you. You feel it when the day ends exactly the way the last one ended. You measure your days by activity instead of control. You confuse movement with direction. You let small internal conversations decide the shape of your effort, then act surprised when the outcome stays the same. You don't notice how often you give yourself permission to drift because the drift feels reasonable in the moment. You keep thinking something external will eventually line up, some momentum, some breakthrough, some clarity that will make all this effort finally convert into progress. But your days are already giving you feedback. They repeat because you repeat. They stall because you stall. They stay familiar because your internal standards stay familiar. You are not confused about what matters. You are confused about why what matters is not responding to the way you operate. And that confusion sits quietly in the background, growing heavier each week, because the work is happening but the change is not. That tension is not accidental. It is being created daily, and it is not finished with you yet. You keep protecting the excuse because it feels logical. You tell yourself the conditions aren't perfect yet, that timing matters, that once a few things settle down your effort will finally land. But that explanation is expensive, and you pay for it quietly every single day. You pay for it by staying in the same position while convincing yourself you are being patient instead of evasive. You don't lose momentum all at once. You lose it in fragments. You lose it in moments where you hesitate and then justify the hesitation. You lose it when you feel resistance and immediately look for a softer version of the task, one that still lets you say you showed up. You don't step away from discipline. You dilute it. And diluted discipline produces diluted outcomes every time. You tell yourself you are being realistic. You call it balance. You call it sustainability. But what you are really doing is protecting a version of yourself that does not want to be cornered by its own standards. You allow internal conversations to renegotiate what enough means depending on how you feel that day. That habit does not look dangerous. It looks responsible. And that is why it survives. You feel the cost when effort no longer builds confidence. You feel it when days blur together and the work starts to feel heavy instead of grounding. You feel it when you realize you are working hard but trusting yourself less. That loss of trust doesn't announce itself. It shows up as hesitation the next time you need to push without being watched. You don't stop because you are incapable. You stop because you keep giving yourself an exit ramp that sounds intelligent. You give yourself permission to adjust standards mid-action, and then you wonder why your identity feels unstable. You are trying to build something solid on rules that change depending on mood, energy, or pressure. You sense it when silence gets uncomfortable. When there is no praise, no feedback, no urgency, and the only thing left is whether you do what you said you would do. That is where things quietly fall apart. Not publicly. Internally. And once that pattern sets in, effort becomes louder while results become quieter. You already know this gap is growing. You already feel that something is being avoided, not externally, but internally. And the longer that avoidance stays unnamed, the more control it takes from you without resistance. This pressure is not here to motivate you. It is here to expose what has been quietly deciding your outcomes. There is a single law operating underneath everything you are experiencing, and it does not care how sincere your effort feels. If control is conditional, then results will always be inconsistent. That sequence never breaks. When control depends on mood, energy, clarity, or external pressure, the outcome reflects that instability with perfect accuracy. You believe effort is the lever, but effort is only the surface expression. The real driver is what you allow to decide your behavior when no one is watching. If internal standards are negotiable, then behavior becomes negotiable. And when behavior is negotiable, identity never settles. It stays fluid, uncertain, and unreliable, no matter how busy your days look. You already live this law daily. On the days you feel sharp, focused, and internally firm, execution feels clean. You move without friction. You don't need to hype yourself up. You don't need reassurance. You simply do what was decided earlier. On the days you feel scattered or heavy, the same tasks suddenly require debate. You revisit decisions that were already made. You start managing yourself instead of directing yourself. That difference is not talent. It is not discipline as an abstract concept. It is control, applied or withdrawn. If you decide who is in charge before the day begins, then behavior follows without noise. If you delay that decision until resistance appears, then resistance takes command by default. Here's the part that usually gets missed. Behavior does not create control. Control creates behavior. You cannot force yourself into consistency by pushing harder while allowing internal loopholes to remain open. Pressure applied on top of weak internal authority only creates fatigue, not alignment. That is why effort keeps increasing while results stay flat. You think the problem is execution, but execution is only reporting back to you what is already true. When you allow yourself to renegotiate standards mid-action, you train yourself to trust feelings over decisions. That training compounds. Over time, even strong effort feels unstable because it is built on shifting ground. This law does not announce itself with drama. It works quietly. Every time you pause to debate instead of act, control weakens. Every time you act without debate, control strengthens. The direction is always clear in hindsight, which is why the frustration keeps returning. You see the pattern after the day is over, not while it is happening. Understanding this law does not fix anything yet. Knowing it only sharpens awareness. You can now see why effort alone never stabilized your progress, and why consistency felt fragile even when you were trying to do everything right. What remains unresolved is where control actually comes from and why it disappears so easily when pressure is low. That layer decides whether this stays insight or turns into something solid. Structure does not exist to make you feel better. It exists to remove negotiation. The first discipline is deciding standards before emotion appears. You lose control when decisions are delayed until the moment of resistance, because resistance always argues more persuasively than intention. Internally, this matters because the mind respects what is settled early and challenges what is left open. When you pre-decide standards, identity stabilizes. You stop seeing yourself as someone who tries and start seeing yourself as someone who follows through without discussion. The daily behavior is simple and unremarkable. You decide the start time, the end time, and the non-negotiable action in advance, then you execute it exactly as decided regardless of how the moment feels. The tension remains because nothing about this feels rewarding in the moment, and the absence of reward tests whether control actually exists. The second discipline is removing emotional commentary during execution. You weaken authority every time you narrate the experience to yourself while doing the work. Internally, commentary creates distance between decision and action, turning execution into a conversation instead of a command. When commentary is removed, identity hardens. You experience yourself as someone who acts without needing internal approval. The daily behavior is quiet. You notice the urge to comment, complain, or assess, and you continue the task without responding to that urge. The tension does not dissolve because silence exposes how often you relied on internal noise to feel engaged. The third discipline is finishing exactly as planned, not as conveniently as possible. Control erodes when you allow endings to drift. Internally, unfinished or softened endings teach the mind that standards are flexible once fatigue appears. When you finish cleanly, identity reinforces itself as precise rather than approximate. The daily behavior is direct. When a task was defined to end at a certain point, you stop there, neither extending for comfort nor cutting short for relief. The tension persists because finishing cleanly removes the emotional escape of almost done and replaces it with finality. The fourth discipline is repeating boring actions without seeking validation. Progress collapses when repetition depends on stimulation. Internally, the need for validation shifts authority outward, making consistency conditional on feedback. When validation is removed, identity becomes internal. You begin to experience yourself as the source of standards rather than the recipient of approval. The daily behavior is plain. You repeat the same controlled actions even when nothing feels new, impressive, or affirming. The tension remains because boredom strips away the illusion that discipline should feel meaningful while it is happening. None of these disciplines provide relief. They are intentionally uneventful. They do not increase motivation or clarity. They only reduce internal movement. That reduction is uncomfortable because it removes the drama that used to justify inconsistency. You are left with action or inaction, with no emotional buffer in between. This structure does not fix you. It exposes you. It reveals whether control is real or only aspirational. When followed, it creates a quiet pressure that does not fade with time, because repetition removes novelty and leaves only identity behind. If you resist this structure, the resistance is not confusion. It is a signal that control has not fully transferred. What remains unresolved is whether you are willing to live without internal negotiation long enough for identity to solidify, or whether you will retreat back into effort that feels active but stays unstable. Discipline stops being fragile when it stops being something you apply and starts being something you are. Effort fails because effort is temporary. Identity holds because it does not ask how you feel before it acts. The instability you experienced before was never about workload or strategy. It was about who had authority when conditions were quiet and no one was watching. When identity is unclear, every action requires energy to restart. When identity is settled, action happens with minimal friction. Self-respect is not a feeling you earn after progress appears. It is the byproduct of keeping promises that no one else can see. Each time you decide something privately and follow through without adjustment, you deposit credibility into your own system. Each time you negotiate or delay, you withdraw from that account. Over time, you start to feel the difference. One version of you moves with certainty because it trusts itself. The other hesitates because it has learned not to believe its own decisions. You don't rise to your goals. You default to your standards. Standards are not what you say you value. They are what you refuse to negotiate when it would be easy to do so. When standards are loose, identity stays soft. When standards are firm, identity hardens quietly. This is not dramatic. It does not come with emotional highs. It comes with predictability, and predictability is what builds control. Boredom is not a sign that something is wrong. Boredom is proof that stimulation is no longer running the system. When actions become boring, they stop feeding the ego and start feeding identity. This is where many people retreat, not because the work is too hard, but because it no longer provides emotional feedback. The absence of feedback feels like emptiness at first, and emptiness exposes whether discipline was ever internal or always dependent on feeling engaged. Quiet consistency is the final separator. Loud effort seeks recognition. Quiet consistency assumes responsibility. When you repeat the same controlled actions without variation, without announcement, and without emotional charge, you begin to experience yourself differently. You stop asking whether something is working and start assuming it is, because your behavior no longer changes based on doubt. That assumption is not optimism. It is authority. Promises to yourself are either binding or meaningless. There is no middle state. Every broken private promise teaches you that your word has exceptions. Every kept promise teaches you that your word is law. Identity forms from that repetition, not from intensity. You don't need to push harder. You need to stop breaking internal contracts and calling it flexibility. Effort can be impressive and still unreliable. Identity is unimpressive and unstoppable. Effort spikes and crashes. Identity shows up the same way whether the day feels light or heavy. When identity is in place, discipline does not feel like discipline. It feels like alignment. There is no inner debate because the decision was already made by the kind of person you decided to be. This lock is not installed through motivation or clarity. It is installed through repetition under low emotion. When days feel ordinary and outcomes feel distant, identity is either being forged or quietly eroded. There is no neutral state. You are always becoming more reliable or more conditional, even when nothing seems to be happening. The pressure you feel now is not meant to inspire you. It is meant to corner you into honesty. Either you accept the boredom, the silence, and the absence of emotional reward, or you return to effort that feels active but never settles. Identity does not announce itself when it arrives. It becomes obvious only when behavior stops needing encouragement. At this point, the issue is no longer understanding. It is acceptance. Acceptance that discipline is not something you turn on. It is something you live as, quietly, daily, without applause. That acceptance determines whether control stays fragile or becomes permanent. You now know where the gap was forming. It was never in knowledge, effort, or intention. It was in control. Control was being treated as something optional, something applied when convenient and relaxed when conditions felt heavy. The results you saw were simply reporting that truth back to you without emotion or judgment. Responsibility begins the moment you stop pretending the pattern was unclear. Once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. You know how often you adjusted standards internally. You know how often you delayed decisions until resistance appeared. And you know what those moments cost you over time. That knowledge changes the situation because awareness removes innocence. From here on, every repetition is either deliberate or avoidant. This is not about becoming intense or extreme. It is about becoming precise. Precision removes drama. Precision removes excuses. When behavior aligns with decided standards, control stabilizes, and life becomes quieter, not louder. That quiet is not emptiness. It is order. Order is what allows effort to finally translate into progress. No one is coming to hold you to your word. No external system will compensate for internal negotiation. That responsibility does not disappear when ignored. It waits. It waits in the form of repeated outcomes, familiar frustration, and the feeling that time is passing faster than progress. Those are not punishments. They are signals. You are now standing at the point where choice becomes ownership. Ownership does not require confidence or certainty. It requires acceptance. Acceptance that control is your job, every day, especially when nothing dramatic is happening. Especially when boredom shows up. Especially when no one is watching. You understand what the issue was. And understanding creates obligation. Once you see the mechanism, you are responsible for whether you continue to feed it or shut it down. From here on, discipline is no longer an idea you agree with. It is a standard you either live by or quietly step away from. That is not pressure. That is clarity. And clarity, once accepted, does not need reinforcement.